London, summer of 1944. The sky screams. Not with the roar of engines or the whistle of falling bombs, but with something far more terrifying. Silence followed by thunder. The V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapons, are raining down on the city at a rate that defies comprehension. 80, 90, sometimes over 100 a day. Each one carries a ton of explosives. Each one is faster than any fighter plane can reliably intercept. The British are desperate. Their gunners fire tens of thousands of shells into the sky and most miss. The V-1s are too fast, too small, too unpredictable. Then, in the span of just weeks, something impossible happens. The kill rate skyrockets from 5% to over 90%. German intelligence is baffled. British commanders are stunned. And at the heart of this miracle is a device so revolutionary, so secret, that even the soldiers firing it don't know what's inside their shells. The Germans had laughed at the American engineer who proposed it, calling his idea fantasy, impossible, the fever dream of a madman. But now, as their terror weapons fall from the sky in flames, no one is laughing anymore. His name was Merle Tuve, and in 1940 he was a physicist at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., far from any battlefield, surrounded by laboratory equipment and theoretical equations. Tuve was brilliant but unassuming, the kind of scientist who could disappear into a crowd despite having one of the sharpest minds in America. He specialized in radio waves and electronics, fields that seemed academic and distant from the brutal reality unfolding across the Atlantic. But Tuve had something that most academics didn't, an imagination that refused to accept the word impossible. The problem was clear to anyone who understood aerial warfare. Shooting down an airplane with conventional anti-aircraft fire was like trying to hit a flying bird with a stone while blindfolded. The gunner had to calculate the aircraft's speed, altitude, trajectory, and dozens of other variables, then set a mechanical fuse to explode at precisely the right moment. The shell would arc through the sky, and if everything went perfectly, if every calculation was exact, if luck was on your side, the shell might explode near enough to the aircraft to damage it. But it almost never did. Studies showed that it took an average of 2,500 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy plane. 2,500 shells. The waste was staggering, the inefficiency maddening, and as war clouds gathered over Europe, Tuve knew that America would soon face an enemy with far more aircraft than anyone wanted to imagine. What if, Tuve thought, the shell could think for itself? What if, instead of relying on precise fuse timing set before firing, the shell could detect when it was near an aircraft and detonate automatically? The idea was elegant in concept but nightmarish in execution. You'd need to put a radio transmitter and receiver inside an artillery shell, a device that would have to survive the crushing acceleration of being fired from a cannon, withstand forces of 20,000 times gravity, function perfectly while spinning at hundreds of rotations per second, operate in temperatures ranging from Arctic cold to scorching heat, resist jamming, and do all of this reliably, cheaply, and in a package small enough to fit inside a 3-inch shell. Oh, and it had to cost less than a few dollars to manufacture because you'd be producing millions of them. When Tuve first proposed this idea to military officials, the response ranged from polite skepticism to outright derision. Some called it a pipe dream. Others said it violated the laws of physics as they understood them. The technology required, vacuum tubes and radio circuits, was fragile under the best conditions. The idea of making such equipment survive the violence of artillery fire seemed absurd. But Tuve was stubborn and he wasn't working alone. He assembled a team at a location that would become legendary in scientific circles. Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. They called themselves the Proximity Fuse Team, and they were about to attempt something that had never been done before. The challenges were immense and immediate. Vacuum tubes, the heart of any radio circuit in that era, were glass bulbs containing delicate filaments. Drop one on the floor and it shattered. Now imagine subjecting one to an acceleration that would turn a human body into paste. The team's first tests were disasters. Tubes exploded, circuits failed, components ripped loose from their moorings. But Tuve's team was relentless. They redesigned the tubes, making them smaller, more rugged, with filaments that could flex instead of snap. They tested hundreds of configurations, each failure teaching them something new. They worked 18-hour days, driven by the knowledge that across the ocean, people were dying because anti-aircraft fire couldn't stop enemy bombers. By 1941 they had a prototype, a radio proximity fuse that could, in theory, detect an aircraft and trigger a shell to explode nearby. The device was ingenious in its operation. It transmitted a radio signal as the shell flew through the air, and when that signal bounced back from a nearby aircraft, the reflected wave would interfere with the outgoing signal in a specific way. This interference would trigger an electric charge that detonated the shell. It was elegant, sophisticated, and it worked in laboratory conditions. But the laboratory wasn't a battlefield. The testing phase revealed problems that the team hadn't anticipated. The fuse had to distinguish between an aircraft and the ground rushing up to meet the shell. It had to ignore rain, clouds, and other interference. Early versions detonated randomly or failed to detonate at all. The team went back to the drawing board again and again. They incorporated fail-safes, backup circuits, and self-destruct mechanisms for shells that missed their targets, preventing the technology from falling into enemy hands. Every component had to be perfect, every connection secure, every calculation precise. By 1942, the fuse was ready for field testing, and the results were stunning. In test after test, the proximity fuse dramatically increased hit rates against target drones. Shells that would have sailed harmlessly past their targets now exploded with devastating precision. The military brass, the same officials who had scoffed at Tuve's proposal, suddenly paid attention. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. But bringing the fuse into mass production presented yet another mountain to climb. The device had to be manufactured by the millions, assembled by workers who had no idea what they were building, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. The security around the proximity fuse was unprecedented. It was given a code name, VT fuse, with VT standing for variable time, a deliberate misdirection to hide its true nature as a proximity device. Workers in factories assembled components without knowing what the final product would do. Only a handful of people in the entire production chain understood the complete picture. The military issued strict orders. The VT fuse could only be used over water or friendly territory where a dud shell couldn't be recovered by the enemy. The fear was justified. If Germany or Japan got their hands on an intact VT fuse, they could reverse engineer it, and the Allies' advantage would vanish. The first combat use of the VT fuse came in early 1943 during the naval war in the Pacific. American ships, constantly under threat from Japanese aircraft, suddenly found their anti-aircraft fire dramatically more effective. Pilots who had grown accustomed to dodging inaccurate flak now faced a curtain of precisely detonating explosions. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese pilots reported that American ships seemed to have developed some kind of supernatural ability to predict their movements. They didn't know about the radio fuse, they just knew that getting near an American destroyer had become a death sentence. But the VT fuse's greatest test was yet to come, and it would arrive in the skies over England in the summer of 1944. Hitler, desperate to reverse the tide of the war after D-Day, unleashed his vengeance weapons on London. The V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives, was a weapon of terror. It flew at nearly 400 miles per hour, low enough to be seen but too fast for most fighters to catch. Its distinctive pulsejet engine gave it a characteristic buzzing sound that Londoners learned to dread. When the engine cut out, you had seconds before the bomb fell and detonated. The V-1s were killing hundreds of civilians every week, and conventional anti-aircraft fire was largely useless against them. The British were desperate for a solution, and the Americans offered one, the VT fuse. But there was a problem. The standing order prohibited using VT fuses over land because of the risk that an unexploded shell might reveal the technology to the Germans. London, obviously, was very much on land. The debate at the highest levels of Allied command was intense. Winston Churchill himself weighed in, arguing that the threat to civilian lives justified the risk. Finally, permission was granted, but with strict conditions. The VT fuses would be used only in specific anti-aircraft zones along the coast, where British forces could recover any duds before the enemy could reach them. The impact was immediate and staggering. Anti-aircraft batteries equipped with VT fuses began shredding V-1s out of the sky at rates that seemed impossible. Guns that had been firing blindly into the air, hoping for a lucky hit, were now destroying target after target with ruthless efficiency. The kill rate climbed from 5% to over 50% almost overnight, and it kept climbing. By August 1944, batteries using VT fuses were downing 9 out of every 10 V-1s that came within range. 90%. The skies over southern England, which had been dark with terror weapons, became a graveyard for Hitler's vengeance. German intelligence was frantic to understand what had changed. They recovered fragments of shells and found strange components, circuits, and vacuum tubes that made no sense in the context of traditional artillery. Some German scientists theorized that the Allies had developed some kind of proximity fuse, but the idea seemed too advanced, too difficult to mass produce. How could the Allies fit a radio transmitter into a shell? How could such a device survive being fired? The reports from the field were clear, though. Something had fundamentally changed about Allied anti-aircraft fire, and it was devastating. The soldiers manning the guns noticed the difference too, though they didn't fully understand why. They knew their shells had special fuses they were ordered to guard carefully and never let fall into enemy hands. They knew that these fuses made their fire dramatically more effective. But the technical details were kept secret even from them. All they knew was that when they fired at a V-1 with the new ammunition, the flying bomb often exploded in a brilliant flash, disintegrating before it could reach its target. For the gunners, it was deeply satisfying after months of futile fire. For the civilians of London, it was the difference between life and death. The VT fuse saved thousands of lives during the V-1 campaign, but its story doesn't end there. As Allied forces pushed into Germany, the proximity fuse was cleared for use over land, and it transformed ground combat as well. Artillery shells equipped with VT fuses could be fired into enemy positions and set to detonate above ground, creating devastating airbursts that negated the protection of trenches and foxholes. Soldiers who had survived by digging in found themselves exposed to explosions that came from above, raining shrapnel down on anyone caught in the open. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided a grim demonstration of the VT fuse's effectiveness in ground combat. German forces, launching a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, were met with American artillery that seemed unnaturally accurate. Shells exploded precisely over German infantry formations, cutting down entire units. German officers reported that American artillery fire had become far more lethal than anything they'd experienced before. The VT fuse didn't win the Battle of the Bulge alone, but it was a significant factor in breaking the back of Germany's last major offensive. After the war, when the secrecy restrictions were finally lifted, the story of the VT fuse became public, and military historians began to assess its impact. The numbers were staggering. It's estimated that the proximity fuse increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by a factor of 5 or more. In the Pacific, where it was used extensively against kamikaze attacks, the VT fuse saved countless ships and lives. In Europe, it neutralized the V-1 threat and made Allied artillery exponentially more deadly. Some historians argue that the VT fuse was one of the most important technological developments of World War II, ranking alongside radar and the atomic bomb in its strategic impact. Merle Tuve, the man who had dreamed of a shell that could think, received numerous awards and honors after the war, but he remained characteristically modest. He often said that the VT fuse was the product of a team effort, that hundreds of scientists, engineers and factory workers had contributed to its success. He was right, of course, but it was his vision that had started it all, his refusal to accept that the problem was unsolvable, his stubborn belief that ingenuity could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The Germans never successfully developed their own proximity fuse during the war. They captured examples of Allied VT fuses, they studied them, they understood the principle behind them, but they couldn't replicate the manufacturing process or the miniaturization required. German industry, strained by years of war and Allied bombing, simply couldn't produce the device in quantity. By the time German scientists had figured out how the VT fuse worked, the war was effectively over. There's a bitter irony in the story of the VT fuse. The weapon that saved so many Allied lives and helped defeat Nazi Germany was also used extensively in wars after World War II in Korea, in Vietnam, and beyond. The technology that Tuve developed to stop bombers and missiles became a standard component of modern warfare. The proximity fuse, in various evolved forms, is still used today in anti-aircraft missiles, naval defense systems and artillery shells around the world. What began as a desperate measure to stop terror weapons became a permanent feature of military arsenals. But in 1944, standing in London as V-1s fell from the sky in flames, none of that mattered. What mattered was that people were being saved, that the terror was ending, that the impossible device dreamed up by a quiet physicist in Washington was working exactly as he'd imagined. The Germans had laughed at the crazy American engineer, dismissed his ideas as fantasy, called the very concept absurd. They weren't laughing anymore. They couldn't. Their flying bombs were burning up before they reached their targets, victims of a technology they couldn't match, couldn't counter, couldn't even fully understand. The story of the VT fuse is a reminder that wars are won not just by soldiers on the battlefield but by scientists in laboratories, by engineers solving seemingly impossible problems, by teams of people who refuse to accept that something can't be done. Merle Tuve and his team at Section T didn't fire a single shot in combat, but they changed the course of the war as surely as any general or admiral. They took an idea that everyone said was impossible and they made it real. They put radios inside artillery shells, they made those shells survive the violence of cannon fire, and they gave Allied forces a weapon that tipped the scales at a crucial moment in history. In the end, the VT fuse is a story about innovation under pressure, about the power of human ingenuity when lives are on the line. It's about a man who looked at a problem that had stumped military minds for decades and said, "What if we try this?" It's about a team that worked through failure after failure, driven by the knowledge that their success would save lives. And it's about a device, a small cylinder of metal and electronics, that flew through the sky at supersonic speeds, detected its target, and detonated with perfect timing again and again 90 times a day, turning the tide of battle and proving that sometimes, the craziest ideas are the ones that change the world. But there's more to this story, details that reveal just how close the Allies came to never having this weapon at all, and moments that show the true cost of innovation in wartime. Behind the triumph of the VT fuse lay a labyrinth of decisions, lucky breaks, and near catastrophes that could have derailed the entire project. The margin between success and failure was razor thin, and understanding just how thin makes the achievement even more remarkable. In the early days of development, Tuve's team faced a crisis that almost killed the project before it truly began. The vacuum tubes they were using, even after extensive redesign, were still failing at unacceptable rates during test firings. The brass was losing patience. Money was being spent, resources were being diverted from other projects, and the results were inconsistent at best. There were serious discussions about canceling the entire program and redirecting the funding to more conventional weapons research. Tuve knew he was running out of time. He needed a breakthrough, and he needed it fast. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a young engineer named Lawrence Hafstad, who had been experimenting with different tube configurations late into the night. Hafstad realized that the problem wasn't just the fragility of the tubes themselves but the way they were mounted inside the shell. The mounting system was allowing the tubes to vibrate at frequencies that shattered them during acceleration. Hafstad designed a new mounting system using rubber cushioning and a revolutionary arrangement that distributed the shock forces more evenly. When they tested it, the improvement was dramatic. Failure rates dropped from over 50% to less than 5%. The project was saved, but it had been a close call, closer than most people ever knew. Then there was the manufacturing challenge, which presented its own nightmare. The VT fuse required components built to tolerances that were extreme even by peacetime standards, and this was wartime production with pressure to produce hundreds of thousands of units as quickly as possible. The team had to train factory workers, most of whom had never worked with electronics before, to assemble devices more complex than anything in mass production at that time. Women, many of whom had never held a job outside the home, were suddenly assembling radio circuits that would fly through the air at supersonic speeds. The training programs were intense, the quality control was rigorous, and the pressure was immense. One factory worker later recalled the stress of knowing that lives depended on her work. She said that every fuse she assembled represented soldiers and sailors who might live or die based on whether she had soldered a connection properly or inserted a component correctly. The weight of that responsibility kept her awake at night. She wasn't alone. Thousands of workers carried that burden, and the remarkable thing is how well they performed under that pressure. The defect rate in VT fuse production was extraordinarily low, a testament to the dedication and skill of people who had been considered unskilled labor before the war. The security measures around the VT fuse bordered on paranoia, but with good reason. Counterintelligence agencies worried constantly about German spies learning about the device. Workers in the factories were told nothing about what they were building or how it would be used. Components were manufactured in different locations and brought together only at the final assembly point. The fuses were shipped in unmarked containers, and the paperwork referred to them only by code designations. Soldiers issued the ammunition were given strict orders. If a ship carrying VT fuses was in danger of being captured, the fuses were to be destroyed, even if it meant scuttling the entire cargo. There was one incident that nearly compromised the entire secret. In 1943, a U.S. destroyer was damaged in combat in the Pacific and had to be towed to port. The ship was carrying VT-fused ammunition, and there was a real possibility it might sink before reaching safety. If it went down in shallow water where Japanese divers could reach the wreckage, the entire technological advantage could be lost. Emergency orders went out: protect that ship at all costs. A screen of vessels surrounded the damaged destroyer, and aircraft provided continuous air cover during the entire tow. The ship made it to port, the ammunition was secured, and the secret remained safe. But it had been terrifyingly close. The psychological impact of the VT fuse on enemy forces is something that often gets overlooked in technical discussions of the weapon. German and Japanese pilots weren't just facing more accurate fire, they were facing fire that seemed impossible. Pilots would report taking evasive maneuvers that should have kept them safe, only to have shells explode right next to them anyway. The effect on morale was significant. When you can't understand why you're being hit, when the enemy seems to have some kind of supernatural ability to predict your every move, it eats away at your confidence and your will to fight. Japanese pilots, in particular, developed almost superstitious beliefs about American anti-aircraft fire in the later stages of the war. Some believed that American ships could read their minds or that they had developed some kind of death ray. The truth that the shells were simply detecting their presence and exploding automatically would have seemed equally impossible to pilots trained in the early years of the war when anti-aircraft fire was notoriously inaccurate. The Japanese High Command tried to investigate, tried to understand what had changed, but they were fighting a war on multiple fronts with diminishing resources, and the mystery remained unsolved. The numbers tell a story of their own, a story written in lives saved and enemy aircraft destroyed. In the Pacific Theater alone, it's estimated that VT fuses accounted for the destruction of thousands of Japanese aircraft. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, one of the largest naval battles in history, American ships using VT-fused ammunition created an anti-aircraft defense so effective that Japanese pilots described it as flying into a wall of explosions. Kamikaze attacks, which the Japanese had developed specifically to counter American naval superiority, became exponentially more dangerous for the pilots. The success rate of kamikaze missions dropped dramatically once VT fuses were widely deployed. Against the V-1s over England, the impact was even more dramatic and more easily quantified. In the first weeks of the V-1 campaign in June 1944, before VT fuses were authorized for use over land, British fighters and conventional anti-aircraft fire were shooting down about 30% of the flying bombs. By August, with VT fuses deployed in coastal anti-aircraft batteries, the destruction rate had climbed to over 90%. 90%. Think about what that means in human terms. For every 10 V-1s launched at London, 9 were being destroyed before they could reach their targets. Each V-1 that was shot down was a ton of high explosives that didn't detonate in a residential neighborhood, a dozen or more lives that weren't ended, families that weren't shattered. There's a photograph from that time, taken by a British civilian in southern England, that captures the impact of the VT fuse better than any statistics. It shows the contrail of a V-1 flying bomb arcing across the sky, and then a brilliant flash where the V-1 has been hit by anti-aircraft fire. You can see the explosion, the debris falling, and in the foreground people on the ground looking up, watching. One person in the photo has their fist raised in triumph. That photograph was published in British newspapers with the caption, "The tide turns." People knew something had changed. They didn't know about the VT fuse, didn't know about Merle Tuve or the team at Section T, but they knew that the terror was ending, that the bombs were falling from the sky before they could strike, and that gave them hope. Hope is a weapon too, perhaps more powerful than any explosive or any device. The VT fuse gave the people of London hope after months of living under the shadow of Hitler's vengeance weapons. It gave Allied soldiers and sailors hope that the technology on their side was superior, that their scientists and engineers were winning the hidden war of innovation. And it took hope away from the Axis powers, forcing them to confront the reality that they were being outthought and outproduced by enemies they had underestimated. After the war ended, when the secrecy restrictions were lifted and scientists could finally discuss their work openly, there was a moment of recognition that what had been accomplished was truly extraordinary. The VT fuse had required breakthroughs in multiple fields: radio engineering, miniaturization, materials science, manufacturing, and quality control. It had required the coordination of universities, government laboratories, private companies, and military organizations. It had required thousands of people to work toward a common goal with absolute dedication and without recognition or glory. And it had worked. Against all odds, against all the skeptics who said it couldn't be done, it had worked brilliantly. Merle Tuve lived until 1982, long enough to see the technology he pioneered become a standard part of modern warfare. He gave occasional interviews about his work during the war, and he always emphasized the same points. It was a team effort. He was fortunate to work with brilliant people, and the real heroes were the soldiers who used the weapon and the civilians who built it. He downplayed his own role, but those who worked with him knew better. Without Tuve's vision and stubbornness, without his refusal to give up when everyone said it was impossible, the VT fuse would never have existed. There's a final twist to the story that brings it full circle. In the decades after World War II, as military historians and scientists analyzed the conflict, trying to understand what factors had been most decisive, the VT fuse consistently ranked near the top of the list. Some experts argued it was more important than any single battle or campaign. Why? Because it multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons systems without requiring massive new infrastructure or resources. Every ship, every anti-aircraft battery that was issued VT-fused ammunition became dramatically more effective overnight. It was a force multiplier on a scale that's difficult to overstate. The Germans had laughed at the crazy American engineer, called his ideas impossible fantasies. But in the end, those impossible fantasies became reality, and that reality helped win a war. The VT fuse stands as proof that innovation matters, that scientific research is not a luxury but a necessity, and that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person who refuses to accept that something can't be done. Merle Tuve was that person, and his legacy is written in the lives saved, the battles won, and the lesson learned. Never underestimate the power of a good idea backed by determination and brilliant execution.